Okay, so since I just got a question about those presentations, we'll start out with those instructions at the top. So I know I haven't mentioned them, but they are in your syllabus as a grade, and I know some of you may be potentially counting on that to even out potentially quizzes and practicals. So we are going to do them. Hopefully they won't be too difficult. I don't think that they will be too difficult, but here's what I want you to do. So I put this link up just now on Brightspace. So our goal for this presentation is really just to show me that you've learned some stuff in this class, and specifically that you've learned a bit about how to talk about plants scientifically and professionally. So you're going to do a little talking, you're going to record me a short little video, and I've detailed kind of our main bullet points of what we've been talking about in this class, right? So I want you to show me that you can describe a plant using professional terminology. So describe what the leaves look like, how they attach to a stem, what a flower looks like, what a fruit looks like, in at least one plant example. I want you to take that same plant and describe something about its life cycle. So here you might have to do a little piecing together. There's not going to be a nice diagram of every single plant. So it's okay if you do a little guesswork, pick a related plant or a general kind of angiosperm life cycle or a general gymnosperm life cycle, and kind of sub in some pictures and make guesses. If you do find a plant that has exact stuff, great, present that. Okay. You're also going to give me a little phylogenetic tree that is related to your plant, and you're going to position your plant within it. So tell me what it's related to, show me a little picture of how they map together. And you're going to put this within some type of overarching structure. And that's the part where use your own creativity, right? So you're going to ask and answer some type of question or tell me some type of story. I'm putting this plant in that context. So if you were feeling uncreative, I did give you some examples down at the bottom of what that might look like. So you might want to discuss plant adaptations and pick a parasitic plant and an epiphytic plant or something. Picking one of them, explaining what that is, and then explaining your plant within that context. Maybe there's some medicinal compound you're really interested in. So that would be the context for your plant. Or a flavor, or just some family you haven't covered in class, etc. So this is a list of options. And I gave an example outline for a presentation that would be potentially on one of these adaptations. Right? I've been a little more structured on this assignment in the past, but really want you to go wild if you want to. If you want to tell me about your favorite plant from childhood, that is totally fine, right? Okay. So you're going to be submitting this assignment by the end of finals, so by the end of the workday, so by 5 p.m., so that I can get around to grading them. I will start grading them as they come in. So if you want to know your grade in this class more quickly, get it to me before the last day of finals. But otherwise, that's your hard deadline. So you're going to have a few slides with relevant pictures, any text regarding this information, including a reference slide. I do not care about citation format, so a title of an article or web page or book plus a link to that is sufficient, or just pick your favorite citation style. Then you're going to have a video recording of you talking through your presentation. If you have ways of recording videos you're super comfortable with, just use those. I don't care if this is, recorded in TikTok or whatever. But here's instructions on how to do it in Zoom. Okay. Yeah. So today is the last time I'm going to be lecturing at you. So next week on Tuesday, you'll have time to kind of work on these and ask me questions. So I do recommend that you think about kind of what that overarching structure for your presentation is going to be and do a little preliminary research so that when you come in here, you can get it done and ask me any specific questions you have, including if you're having difficulty finding particular pieces of information. That's a great time I could help with that. And then Thursday, we're going to do our lecture quiz plus basically lab review or any makeup lab. So I'll pull together what I can pull together for that. So that's kind of how we're going to round out our term, our semester. Questions about this? Cool. It's going to require a little bit of Googling, a little bit of work, but hopefully this is well within your wheelhouse at this point. So on that note, we're going to switch to our final section of information. So our final big group that we're going over are our dicots or our eudicots or eudicots. Okay, because they had to change it because they changed the phylogeny. But traditionally, these are just known as dicots. So this is like our opposite from monocots, which we went over last week. So our palms, a bunch of our house plants, our corn. So now we're going to be thinking about really a lot of the plants that you'll be putting in your garden this summer, things like that. A lot of the trees that you see outside, all of the trees other than your conifers, really. Okay. So we've kind of walked through lots and lots of land plants in this course. So this would be an example of a phylogeny. So we've walked through our mosses, our bryophytes, our ferns, our pteridophytes, our gymnosperms, our conifers, our pine trees. Now we've been in angiosperms. We talked about our basal ones and our magnoliids. We talked about some monocots. So now we're down at the tippy tip of this tree with our dicots. Okay. So our dicots or eudicots are paired together with one little group of plants, the Theridophilales. This is just a group of pond plants. We're not going to think much more particularly about this. These are sometimes called coontails or hornworts. They are our sister group to the eudicots. So that's really the context in which you might see them mentioned. You can see them as a relatively common aquarium plant. That's about what I have to say about that. So not super important. So our dicots, we're recognizing separate from our monocots based on the fact that they're going to have two cotyledons. So when you see them sprout up, you're going to expect to see two little baby leaves on your shoot. Their veins are usually going to look kind of net-like, so they might be pinnate, they might be palmate, but they're going to have like a lot of branching within them. If you cut the stem, you're going to see rings of vascular bundles. So the xylem and the phloem is like structured in these circles within the stem. Usually we see like a taproot with branches coming off of it. And in our floral parts, instead of being multiples of 3, now we're going to see multiples or 4 or 5, or honestly, sometimes it may not be super countable when we are looking at some members of our dicots. If we were to look at a root, we'd see a little kind of X or star shape in the center. So the main way that they're consistently different from other groups is not terribly useful to us if we're walking out in the field, because it's based on the pollen. They have triculpate pollen, so it has 3 sort of bulges here. So I'm going to recommend that you tell them apart based on knowing some of the major groups and then recognize that a plant just looks kind of like that. But if you had a microscope and you had some pollen, you could tell it apart. So most of the plants that you're familiar with are probably dicots. So our leafy trees around here are pretty much all eudicots. So your maples, your oaks, your birch, your aspen are all in this group. And so are most of the plants that we're planting around this time of year. So sunflower, dandelion, cabbage, apples, tomatoes, beans, etc. So here we can see how they would come up. I think this is some little tomato shoots. So we can see those 1, 2 cotyledons that were within the seed. Now we have these 1, 2 little first leaves before we get our first set of true leaves that are going to have more structured kind of shape to them. And here we see an example of a sunflower. So on that leaf, we can see that net-like vein system already, right? So this is maybe pinnate, but you can see that midrib. You can see branches off of it, probably more branches from that. You can see that these petals, probably not in multiples of 3. So we do have big phylogenies of dicots. So this is from a working group that is working on angiosperm phylogeny in general. This is from the angiosperm phylogeny group. You can see there's lots of stuff within it, so we are not going to go through everything. So one of your topics on that potential presentation list is to just pick some group we haven't talked about and talk about it. What we're going to talk about are 2 big groups that you see within here that we can kind of circle out, which are our asterids. So asters and our rosids. This makes up actually 50% of all angiosperms, adding these groups together. So that's not even including the basal angiosperms and the monocots, right? 50% of all angiosperms. So this is really, really helpful to be able to kind of recognize these two kind of superclades. This isn't an order or a family or any specific taxonomic rank. This is just, we recognize this as kind of a group. So some main characteristics that you'll notice broadly, generally, when you're looking at these two groups. A difference you would see in the flowers has to do with whether the petals are separated from each other or fused at the base. So a lot of the roses we describe as polypetalous, so poly for many. So we have multiple separate petals. This is a perfect place to notice that counting petals game. You can win that he loves me not game every time if you know whether you have a rosid or some monocot, right? Do some math. Okay, so we can see that 5 petal arrangement here rather than multiples of 3. Do not just turn on, do not disturb. Okay. Here we see an asteroid from the side, so less helpful for counting from this view, but you would similarly be able to count with this asteroid. But we can see that these petals kind of fuse together at the base, and that's pretty typical of a lot of our asteroids. So you can see those coming together. We refer to this as sympetallous. So sim or together, petallous for petals. Okay. So some of these words should be kind of familiar, either from daily life or from previous labs. So we're going to start with the rosids. Anybody have guesses about what's going to be in this group? I know for a fact that there's one easy one that you can all think of looking at that word. It's a group of angiosperms, but our rosids specifically are going to include things like roses, right? That's a gimme. And we looked actually in our fruits lab at a little phylogeny of a family within this group, the Rosaceae. And when we were looking at like our apples and our pears and cherries and peaches, right, that was a family within this group. So we'll touch back on that in a second. But we've seen these before. Okay. There are lots and lots and lots of rosids. So the rosids of that over 50% make up 25% of our angiosperms. So here's a figure from a recent-ish paper on whether they were tropical or non-tropical, what temperatures they grow in. But you can see here we have an awful lot of things, including some things you might not expect, right? In a rose family, right? We have our citrus groups, we have our hibiscus. I haven't looked at all of these, but we have lots and lots of different species, different families here. Our roses are up over here, tons of stuff. Okay, so they're both tropical and temperate, and they've had an explosion of diversity, quote unquote, recently. The last 15 million years, they've really kind of expanded in cooler climates. Okay, so we're going to pick out just 3 families to be able to recognize for ourselves from our roses. So we're going to take a look at the Fabaceae. So this is going to be your legumes, so like the pea family, so peas and beans. We're going to touch back on Rosaceae, which we saw in our fruits lab. And we're going to take a look at Brassicaceae. Okay. Before we talk about that first group, the Fabaceae, the legumes, I want to talk briefly about nitrogen fixation. Does somebody want to tell me why a plant would need nitrogen? Or why any living thing would need nitrogen? So what would you need nitrogen to build, like in biology? Right? Imagine you're building some plant cells, because that's what a plant is doing. Yeah, exactly. So plants need amino acids. They have that amine group with the nitrogen in it. But nitrogen isn't going to come from the sunlight that our plants are doing photosynthesis with, right? So they're going to need to get nitrogen essentially from like the air and the soil. Actually, a lot of our nitrogen is not bioavailable to plants. Animals don't have to worry about this as much because they eat things that contain protein, so they can break that down for amino acids, but a plant isn't really doing that unless we're thinking about like a carnivorous plant. So carnivorous plants are actually partially an adaptation for a different way of getting nitrogen. Okay, so this is where nitrogen fixation comes in. So nitrogen in the air is in the form N2, which is not really bioavailable. So it's just like an inert gas hanging around. The plants can't really breathe that in and do much with it. So they need to soak it up in the form of nitrates, nitrites, ammonia, right? That they can actually do something with. And they can't turn the nitrogen in the air into that form on their own. So we have something called the nitrogen cycle that takes that nitrogen in the air and pulls it into forms that plants actually can use and essentially soak up through their roots, right? A cool part of the nitrogen cycle is that lightning can do this, right? But we can't sit around just like waiting for lightning and have that be our only source of nitrogen in the soil. So bacteria are actually good at this. So there are nitrogen fixing bacteria that can take that nitrogen in the form that's in the air and fix it, turning it into compounds that the plant can take in. Okay, so we're going to need to form a symbiosis with bacteria essentially for our plants to take up nitrogen. And not every plant can do that. So nitrogen fixing plants, particularly legumes, so in this next family we're about to talk about, the Fabaceae, have a symbiosis with this bacteria. So if you dug up their roots, you'd see these weird little nodules on them potentially. So this is a little house for the bacteria, right? So these plants have these nodules housing bacteria inside. They're fixing the nitrogen into ammonia that the plant can then take up. In return, the plant is presumably giving them sugars or something. So this is why, for example, we practice like crop alternation if we don't want to use a ton of fertilizer, right? Planting things like peas helps get nitrogen back into the soil by basically having plants that can form the symbiosis with bacteria and replenish soil after you've grown a crop that soaks up all the nitrogen and can't fix it. Otherwise, you're going to need a bunch of fertilizer containing nitrogen in a bioavailable format for plants to soak up. Okay, so we're going to be talking first about Fabaceae. They are in a larger group called the Fabids. This is just referencing back to one of those previous phylogeny images. So all our nitrogen fixer are in this larger group, Fabids, and most of them are the ones we think about most are specifically within the family Fabaceae. But there are a bunch of orders in this larger group. So Fabales, including our beans, Rosales, our family Rosaceae that we're going to talk about will be in here. Squashes, cucumbers, and melons are also here in this group. And a bunch of our trees are also here. So Fagales actually includes oaks, birches, and walnuts. So we're not going to go over all these groups. We're going to focus on a couple of them. So we're going to focus as one of our three on the family Fabaceae. So this is the most famous nitrogen fixing family, consistently pretty much nitrogen fixing, lots and lots of plants here. I hesitate to say all, but I can't actually think of a counter example, are going to fix nitrogen. So if you hear someone say legumes, they're really referring to this family pretty much always. So they have these characteristic flowers, and we'll take a look at how you could recognize a flower from this sort of pea family. But in general, we're going to have flowers that look kind of like this with like a keel and wings. And then our legumes are going to form legumes, which are these basically pea pod shaped structures. Okay. So if you are out in the field around here, you will see some members of the Fabaceae family once we actually have flowers. So you can look for them over the summer. So here's some patterns you'll see. So the flowers are going to be kind of irregular, maybe some bilateral symmetry. So we might consider them zygomorphic here. So they're going to have a structure that's called a banner. So just think kind of like a banner over like a balloon arch or something. So that's this big piece, essentially. It's going to have wings here surrounding like a little boat in the center. So that's the general structure of a pea flower. So you can see this in the images to the right. So here you can see that big banner over the top and these little wings here. Same thing in profile here in yellow. So here you can see that banner, the wings, and then this boat-like keel structure. Other characteristics you'd see would be the pea-like pods, so those legumes. And when we look at their leaves, they're often going to be compound leaves. So here's an example of a locust tree. So you can see that instead of just leaves individually coming off the stem here, we have a big compound leaf with many little leaflets here. So this leaf happens to be pinnately compound. So here's some more examples. So this is some of the variety of types of compound leaves you would see within our legumes. So we have a lot of pinnately compound ones or doubly pinnate, but there are other options as well. And here's a zoomed in picture of a little clover, right? So clover is going to be one of our most common plants within this family. Super easy, super good for the soil to have a bunch of clover because clover can fix nitrogen through the symbiosis. But you might not immediately realize that it's part of this family because the flowers just look like little clusters. But if we were to look even closer at each of those little florets within our clover, if you were to pull one off, you'd notice that each tiny little flower here does have that same structure. So here you can see that big banner. Here you can see those little wings. And here you can see that little keel. So when the clover eventually comes out, take a look at it. Maybe pick little ones. You can suck kind of like honey off the base of them. Kind of fun. Okay. If you wanted a fuller list of some of the characteristics, you're going to have basically all kinds of plants here. So some will be trees like our locust trees. Okay, so if you ever see those sort of pea pods hanging down off a tree, right, that's going to tell you this is in the family Fabaceae and likely a nitrogen fixer. Those compound leaves, right? We also have shrubs, flowers, herbs. So the lupines will be coming out sometime. So those are also within the Fabaceae family, although they're not really native to here. They're very pretty. Okay. Their flowers are generally bisexual. They technically have 5 sepals fused together, technically 5 petals here. They have lots of stamens. So in some of our flowers that really just look like poofs, that's because you just have tons and tons of stamens as the visible part. So occasionally you'll see a flower that doesn't look like this pea flower, but you would notice that the leaves look kind of like the Fabaceae family because of this compounding. And poofy structure is a possible option for us in this family. They tend to have one carpel, and really recognizable is if you see this fruit. So usually a legume, just name the fruit really for this family, or potentially a lomen, which just looks like a legume. It's just a little more separated out. Yeah. So just more and more examples. We'll look at whatever I can get on Thursday, but here we see some subfamilies here, so some more groupings. So here you can see a subfamily that includes those like spikier sort of puffball kind of flowers here, including that mimosa tree that we had on the previous slide. And here you can see the subfamily that tends to have this structure with the banner, wings, and keel over here. So some things are pointed out here. And a counter example, a little genus that does happen to have simple leaves and lacks this compounding. So like with our other descriptions, these are generalities. Most plants within the groups we talk about have most of these characteristics, but evolution is a dynamic process. So we're always going to have some that have something different going on. Okay, So our next family is within the order Rosales. So we're going to take a look at the Rosaceae family. So we looked at these before when we were talking about fruits because these are really important commercially. So we have a picture of all our fruits in this family. So we got our pears, our peaches and nectarines, plums, apples. We got cherries, apricots, almonds, lots and lots of stuff. Apples, I said that already. Whatever, lots of things, including roses, which is why it's the family Rosaceae. They don't have a ton of common characteristics, but in general, their flowers are going to be kind of pretty. They're often actinomorphic with radial symmetry, often 5 sepals, 5 petals, often have a hypanthium. And inside their seeds, you're often going to see amygdalin, which can release cyanide when it's processed during digestion. So that's why they say cyanide smells like bitter almonds, right? Almonds are in this family. We spoke briefly about this when Krista came and guest lectured. All right, so here are some images from that fruits lab looking at some of the flowers in this family. So some examples of our raspberry, strawberry, cherry, apple, peach, and pear. And here's an expanded phylogeny of some of the normal and less normal looking fruits within our Rosaceae family. Okay, so remember, as we're going through, one of those traits is that we often see a hypanthium. So did want to remind you that that hypanthium is this cup-like receptacle kind of at the bottom. And that was what was forming in our apple, really, that flesh of the apple, right? So most of that edible part was from a structure other than the ovary, making this kind of an accessory fruit. Okay. So we do see a number of different types of fruits within the Rosaceae family. Okay. So our third family that we're going to go over in the rosettes, so the last one is going to be the Brassicaceae. So this is coming from a large, it is a family of like cabbages and mustards. This is economically important because actually just one species within this family has been wildly diversified into a lot of food we eat, including cabbage, also Brussels sprouts, mustard greens, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So to recognize things in this family, which is more broadly known as the mustard family, looking at a flower, so if you have a flower, you're going to see that there are usually 4 petals. So 4 petals here, 4 little sepals. Okay. The mustard seed pods are going to look kind of like peas, but they're generally going to be like long and skinny. So they're going to be smaller. You probably wouldn't mistake them if you see them in real life. Other shapes are possible, but they're always going to kind of spiral around the stalk along a raceme, so like along a central kind of axis. Okay. So I have some examples there, but really the one that we want to know best is this one species, Brassica oleracea, which is cabbage and cauliflower and kale and broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and kohlrabi, just with different parts of the plant selectively bred for. So the same way you can get like different apple varieties, these are all really just varieties of the same plant. So here we have some pictures of like what we took and emphasized through selective breeding in each of these plants. So cauliflower and broccoli are just tiny little flower buds and that stem going through them. On Brussels sprouts, we're looking at leaf buds, but specifically out to the sides. For cabbage, also leaf bud, but right on the end, just selected for one big one. Kohlrabi is coming from the stem. Kale, collards are coming from the leaves, but these are all the same plant in a way anyway. There are lots of other roses. Here's a list of them. I'm not going to go over them in particular, but as you are looking for plants to add to your collection, these are things you might see or might look for, some of them. I'm going to pull out a picture of buckthorn because it's a big problem around here. So super, super invasive. Buckthorn is in the family Rhamnaceae, basically killing everything around us and really hard to get rid of. A thing that we don't see around anymore, but used to be super common, are elm trees. So they used to line lots and lots of streets. They used to be very common street trees, but they have a disease, Dutch elm disease, that killed off most of the elms, basically. So you don't see them around that much anymore. Okay. So next we're going to talk about the other big group of dicots, also a very large group within angiosperms more generally. So this is the astrid. Okay, so they're a third of angiosperm species, so they're even bigger than the rosids. You're going to recognize them kind of based on fused petals. They're adapted for pollination, so we're going to see lots of cool flowers here. And the flowers are often going to occur in clusters. So here are some of the families and orders within this group. Here are some examples. Okay. We're going to go through a few families. So we're going to talk about the Asteraceae, which is how we get the name of this group. So that's going to be daisies and sunflowers. We're going to take a look at Solanaceae, which is the nightshade family, important because it includes a bunch of food: tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, peppers. We're going to talk about the Lamiaceae, a bunch of herbs, especially mint. And we'll talk about the Ericaceae, which includes blueberries. Okay, so we're going to start with the Asteraceae. So anything that looks like a daisy or a dandelion, pretty much, you should suspect it in the Asteraceae. So these are very characteristic flower forms for our asters. So these are actually compound flowers. I pulled out a weird example for you. This actually happens to include artichokes because their flowers kind of look like this. They just look real weird as they mature. Okay. So patterns you would look for. So because this is a compound flower, we're probably not going to try to count petals as such, because when we looked at our flower lab, we mentioned that when we're looking at compound flowers, one of the ways we structure these is we can have disc florets and ray florets coming together to look like one larger flower structure. So anything that pretty much looks like this is going to be an aster. But technically, the flower is either a disc floret in the center or a ray floret with one big sympetalous petal all kind of fused together out at the sides. So each of the seeds in a flower like this is coming from an individual flower. So dandelions are in this group. So when you think about a dandelion puffball, right, each of those seeds has come from like each of these little disc florets, essentially. Or a sunflower. Each of those sunflower seeds is coming from each of these tiny little individual flowers inside. So we can see here that petal fusion isn't obvious if you're looking from afar, right? We said that asterids in general are sympetalous. These are technically, because if you look at each floret, those petals have fused together. But if you were looking from far away and didn't realize this was a compound flower, you might not realize it, and you might think these were separate petals. Here we see some dissection, so showing you those ray flowers and disc flowers, pulling them out, showing you which parts are the petals, which parts are where we had the stamen, the stigma, and so on. And here we've sliced one open. Okay. And here we see a sunflower, so fully mature, ready to pick out those sunflower seeds. So each of those seeds coming from each of the little disc flowers. So next, the Solanaceae, or the nightshades. So including deadly nightshade, but also including many foods and medicines, drugs. So examples include the potato, the eggplant, the tomato, the pepper, also tobacco and belladonna, which is the deadly nightshade. So here we can see the variety of fruits within this family. And here we see a close-up of a flower. So this is a very stereotypical flower shape that you're going to see in the Solanaceae family. So if we're picking out traits, if we're looking at the stem, We're going to expect it to have alternate leaves. Often those leaves are going to be pubescent, so they're going to be like hairy, and they're going to have a smell to them. If you think about that smell of a tomato plant, you can kind of get that idea. There are 5 petals and 5 sepals. Because it's in the asterid group, you're often going to see those petals, like in the previous image, coming together, right? You can see these are sympetallous, so those petals aren't separate. Okay. They mostly have varying amounts of this poisonous compound solanine. That's where the family gets its name, or actually probably it's the reverse, right? But same word, right? Solanine from the Solanaceae. So this would occur in the leaves, the fruit, and the tubers. So when people tell you not to eat some part of plants in this family, that's why our food plants are selected or adapted to have less of this, right, and not poison us. But I would not go out wild foraging, see a plant that looks kind of like this and be like, oh, why don't I try? Would be a bad time. Okay. So you're going to expect to see 5 sepals coming together, 5 petals, 5 stamens. The ovary is going to have 2-ish chambers. So we can see these various things pointed out on some of these examples. Here are some different species within this group. Here we see some pictures, including the stem and that leaf shape, some more examples. And we're going to move on to our mint family. So the Lamiaceae family is usually herbs. So it's going to include basil, rosemary, mint, thyme, sage. So it's going to look different. So the leaves, like in the Solanaceae, are often going to be fragrant. So if you think about any of those herbs, right, that's kind of why we're eating them. The leaves are going to be simple, so no compounding, so just one leaf on each side. Up the stem, obviously, so insects. The flowers are going to be in little clusters. So you can see these sort of clusters of flowers, in this case, interspersed with the leaves. They look kind of like the flowers in our Fabaceae. So they're kind of like our pea flowers, or kind of like our orchids, right? So they're going to have an upper lip and a lower lip, but you can see they don't really have that keel structure that we mentioned. So there are subtle differences here when you're looking at these flowers. Okay. They're zygomorphic, so you can draw a line of bilateral symmetry down them. And a feature that I like to look for is that if you have a stem of one of these plants, it's often kind of square. So you'll often feel kind of like ridges on it. So some patterns that we would look for, you have technically 5 united petals. So we're in kind of lobes. Looks like we have an upper and a lower lip. On the upper lip, technically we'd have like 2 lobes. On the lower lip, we have 3-ish. The sepals are often forming this kind of tubey looking structure. Okay. What else is good? So that square stalk you can see here, so squared off like that. And there you see those opposite leaves and the flower clusters between them on this example. Our final family we are going to know for our purposes is Ericaceae. So this is the blueberry family. A useful thing in the Ericaceae is that, like the Fabaceae, they do tend to form a symbiosis. But in this case, rather than forming a symbiosis with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, they often form a symbiosis with fungi, so like mushroom-ish, in the soil that help them grow in poor sandy soils. So you'll often see blueberries places where the soil is not so great, and other plants kind of within this family. So you can see them in a lot of sort of fields where the soil is kind of sandy and there's not necessarily that much nutrition in that soil. So here we can see some examples, and we can see some patterns. We might call it the heath family. So heath or heather is within this group as well. So these flowers are going to look really different. They're going to look kind of like bells. So they have 4 or 5 sepals joined together at the base, but then we have a bell or kind of urn shape with a little kind of star on the end. They're usually going to have lots of stamens kind of in the center of this bell. And the leaves are often going to be evergreen. Okay. So here we can see some examples of that bell shape, right? So we can see that bell kind of shape to it. We can see leaves kind of whorled here. So we can see that they're not opposite like we just saw in the Lamiaceae. We have this kind of whorled structure, many leaves coming together at one node. And here we can see some more characteristics. Taking a look at that ovary, we have a superior ovary here. You can see some anthers. So some other characteristics that are a little more detailed than I would expect you to look at. But here are some more examples so you can get the, like the technical biology word is Gestalt because old biologists like to speak German, but like the vibe of these plants, right? That's basically what that means. All right, so here you can see those bell or urn-shaped flowers all within this genus here. So that should be recognizable. And you can think about what a blueberry looks like on an end and kind of imagine how we form into that shape. Okay, cool. So that is it for today. We got some time. So if you want to start planning your presentations right now, I'll stick around. But otherwise,